So, welcome back, everyone, online and offline participants. It's a great honor to have Sraddhalu Da with us today. And before we go to what he will be talking about, I want to share one of my personal experience. Many years ago, I think it was 2009, I was attending a conference in Delhi University on mathematics and spirituality. And there, Shraddhaluda was talking. I did not know Mother and Sri Aurobindo then. I had no experience what he was talking of. But what one thing that I knew was whatever he's saying, I would want to know, that aspiration was there and there was some resonance. And I never knew that years later, I'll be standing here next to you and with Mother and Sri Aurobindo. So it's a delight. Sraddhalu Da is a scientist, educator, and a scholar, and he has inspired thousands of teachers worldwide with his workshops, delivered lectures in 30 countries worldwide on education, management, self-development, and yoga. And today, Sraddhalu Da will be talking about ranges of consciousness and experiences imminent in our evolution.
Since the theme of this conference is about the growth of our consciousness in growing, deepening, and widening, which would represent, so to say, the three dimensions of the growth of consciousness, the topic which I chose is of ranges of consciousness and experiences which are imminent in our evolution. And I want to highlight this term imminent because in terms of human evolution, we have been through stages going back perhaps many thousand years that we know in our current memory, but actually going back through many hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that we do not record currently in our history, where there was always this aspiration for the spirit, the effort to realize the spiritual, but the capacity had not developed sufficiently. There were even stages, Sri Aurobindo observes, where humanity as a whole had opened to a higher grade of consciousness than today. But it was premature, there was not the sufficient foundation, and therefore a relapse from those higher grades. He speaks of an intuitive phase of human evolution long back, from which there has been a relapse into an intellectual phase again today. And this is the reason he explains why we are able to rapidly build up our intellectual capacity, because it is work already done long back that's being recovered. But why the relapse? Because this base of the intellect was not sufficiently established in the collective consciousness. And therefore now, when we make through this base a new effort to rise to an intuitive consciousness, for example, the solidity of the present base assures us that that will be reached. And this is something extremely important for us to recognize. Had we been born, let's say 5,000 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, we would still have perhaps said, oh, we are in a preparatory phase for the realizations. Today we are no more in a preparatory phase. We are here for the realization. You will remember the mother giving this assurance to the disciples in the playground, which included some of the elder disciples and some of the younger children who were not even disciples, who had no intention even or interest to be disciples. And I use the word disciple in a specific way, as distinct from devotees. Devotee is one who has devotion, a disciple is one who follows a discipline. And to all of these people, the mother says, you are here because you were given the promise that when the time came for the realization, you would be given a chance. And then she says, you may not remember, but I remember. And these words, when we read them today, they are printed in a book, perhaps there's a recording, I do not know. These words for each one of us, we must accept as her statement to us as we are today. We are here because we have been given the chance to participate when the time for the realization has come. And I want to highlight this fact, the time for the realization has come. Sri Aurobindo and the Mother did not need to incarnate with the full power of the supramental consciousness if the time had not come for the realization. There were many of what we call vibhutis, partial emanations in the past, which have been preparatory for this time. And so we could have had one more vibhuti. But the incarnation of a full avatar who brings down the new supramental consciousness is because of the readiness in humanity. And again, we must make this distinction. It is not that all of humanity is ready, because there are large parts which, as the Mother pointed out in the 60s, and of which you see the evidence today, there are large parts which are choosing to regress into an animal mentality, even losing the higher capacities of the intelligence and choosing. And there is another part that chooses to rise. So it's not even that everybody on earth is ready for it. It means the collective consciousness in the higher part of humanity is ready. And I would go so far as to say, if you're listening to this, if you're watching a recording of this, it doesn't matter, because you're interested in this topic, it is because something within you is already ready. And while on the surface in your mind you may not know, you may not remember, your soul remembers. And so the exhortation which I would offer is, remember why you took birth. Remember why you took birth in this lifetime. Because your soul knows, you do not on the surface. It is your soul that chose this knowledge that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother have given to us. It was your soul that recognized this deep connection with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, because we have been with them before, not once but many times, under different names, under different forms, in different circumstances. They have brought us here today having kept their promise. And the question I would ask is, what is your side in this fulfillment of their promise? Will you at least make the effort to remember that you had asked for this, or that you had taken birth for this? And being here today, will you then at least make the effort to put into practice, with the help that they actively give you, to realize that thing for which we were born, that thing for which the time has come, that thing which is imminent in our evolution? And therefore this word imminence, and it may not be for all of humanity, but it is certainly true for a large part of the higher grade of humanity that feels the call, where the soul is at least half awake and recognizes the moment. And I would suggest all of us who are bothering to listen to this, who find it interesting, are already part of that. The question though is, do we make the effort to remember and then to put into practice, to rebuild that deeper contact on the surface which we already have within us, with Sri Aurobindo, with the Mother, with the Divine Consciousness? And for that, an effort is required. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that even for those who have an initial opening of some experience of the Spirit, it is because the soul has already done the work in the past. And what prevents its natural emergence now is often, he says, a strong habit by prior education. And this is one of the great disasters of modern education. And he explains exactly what it is. It's a distortion that it forces you to turn outward in an exaggerated turn of the mind and of the emotions. And the whole of your nature is turned by habit into this outward exaggerated move, to the point that an inward turn is often impossible, or seems so, when in fact that should be the easiest thing possible. That was already present when we were children, isn't it? And I still meet people who say, oh, I can feel everything around, but I can't feel anything within. And yet they have experiences, glimpses of the spirit, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes under special conditions. And that's purely because of this distortion that has come with the education. And had we perhaps grown up in a different circumstance of education, that gap of the inner and outer would not have been. To this extent, Sri Aurobindo says in I believe it is late 20s or early 30s, when he was shown certain books with images of people in Europe doing experiments with planchette and mediumship and materializations, he said, well, because in Europe the consciousness is so thick and dull, it's okay for them to play with this. But if this had happened in India, it would be disastrous. He uses this word disastrous. Why? He says because the Indian consciousness is very finely balanced between the inner and the outer. And the slightest nudge allows it to go either way. Very finely balanced. This is the exact phrase he uses. And why is this so? Not because of effort you have made, because of the effort of your ancestors who have built and infused into the civilization certain values of the spirit. And when I say this again, today we are in an age which is more universal. It is not to decry or criticize other spaces, because when we speak of the Indian civilizational values, they could be present elsewhere. They could be present among people who have taken births in other climes, in other nationalities, but who have also prepared themselves within this Indian space, because this Indian space has been protected for the spiritual purpose going back at least 5,000 years of recorded history. The result of that is this very fine balance. And irrespective of where you are born today, in whatever color of skin or nationality, that preparation you did in those past lives is present with you, except when it has been damaged by the education, giving it a hard outward turn. I'm highlighting all this for a very important reason, with the hope that it will reawaken in you the conviction of the access to these experiences. Because the readiness has already been built up in the past, and if today you feel something blocked, it is purely because of this exaggerated turn, which can be easily corrected. Because what has been built up over a few thousand years cannot be lost in a few years of distortion. So the imminence is the first thing I want to highlight, and as a result, as a consequence with this larger context, the proximity and the accessibility to these states of consciousness and these experiences, and with the hope that it will encourage all of you to make that effort. I'm going to read from one of Sri Aurobindo's aphorisms. This is aphorism number 5 from this little book, Thoughts and Aphorisms, you all probably know. And this is in the context of something he is discussing about the higher kind of knowledge and wisdom. And then he says, aphorism 5, if mankind could but see, though in a glimpse of fleeting experience, what infinite enjoyments, what perfect forces, what luminous reaches of spontaneous knowledge, what wide calms of our being lie waiting for us in the tracts which our animal evolution has not yet conquered. So you've seen all this described. If we could see but in a fleeting glimpse, they would leave all and never rest till they had gained these treasures. See, the nature of these experiences is so overwhelmingly wonderful. I'm carefully using the word not powerful. Also there is the aspect of power, but wonderful. So extraordinary, so beautiful, so captivating in their blissfulness, that if you had a fleeting glimpse, that is, in a flash you had this glimpse and it's past, of all of these things, infinite enjoyments, perfect forces, luminous reaches of spontaneous knowledge, and wide calms of our being, which are already there. They lie waiting. It's not something you have to develop. It's not something you have to find. It's already right there and it's waiting for you. But in the tracks which our animal evolution has not yet developed. And that's all. And literally, if you had to put a place to it, it is just above your head. just above this band of intellect in which we are habitually living. Just here, it's that close. In all of us, no exception. So if we had a fleeting glimpse of that, we would leave all and never rest till we had gained these treasures. That's how wonderful that fleeting glimpse is. But then he says, but the way is narrow, the doors are hard to force, and fear, distrust, and skepticism are there, sentinels of nature, to forbid the turning away of our feet from her ordinary pastures. So we are like sheep. We have been penned in by her ordinary pastures. And nature, and he is referring to lower nature, mechanical nature, nature in ignorance. She has sentinels, 3 sentinels: fear, distrust, and skepticism. The fear comes in this way typically: what will happen if I leave behind all these things which are so necessary for my survival, for my future? If I stop earning money, what will happen? Who will look after me in my old age? These are typically the kinds of thoughts for which we are as if programmed by our education and the media to spend the bulk of our life struggling to prepare for what we would want to do afterwards and never start doing it right now. And that's part of the programming, unfortunately. But the fear takes many forms, including when an experience dawns on you, you say, wow, what is this? It's too much, and you shut it down. Will I die? That's the commonest reaction of the ego when it faces something which is so vast. Then there is distrust. And the distrust particularly is not only in the nature of the experience, but in the nature of the path itself. And finally, there is the skepticism, which actually goes so far as to say, this is not possible, this is not within my reach. And one of the forms it takes, which unfortunately today is so harmful, is it says, it is for those great sadhakas, for those great people to do, not for me. Perhaps in my next life when I might be more ready. That's the nature of the thought again programmed into you. And it is so damaging. Because look back at each of those great sadhakas that today you celebrate as great. When they came to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, they were not better than any of us. Many were far worse. Many had no formal education of any kind. Many had no capacity even inherent in their basic framework of nature. And Sri Aurobindo points to some of them and points out how within 2 years they developed these extraordinary capacities. Perhaps one of the most celebrated example is one of somebody who was named Romain Palit. Having come here within 2 years, he became an extraordinary literateur, poet, musician, singer, and the poetry that was flowing was just flowing every day, and of such an extraordinary grade. And Sri Aurobindo points to that example. Another example he gives somebody who came as the tabla player to Dilip Kumar Roy, who had absolutely no formal education of any kind and no obvious capacities of any kind. And within 2 years, he becomes this extraordinary artist. His paintings, even to this day, are seen as masterpieces. And he says, you cannot explain this kind of an extraordinary progress if not for the yoga force. So the so-called great came as ordinary, perhaps as good or as bad or worse than us. It was the opening to the yoga force and the action of the Divine Mother and Sri Aurobindo working in them, which made for whatever you might consider a greatness. So that argument in particular, where you want to postpone things, is one of the greatest errors one could make. And so skepticism here, we have to consciously erase, as well as the distrust and the fear. But then the 2 things which are required for us to be able to attain to these experiences, he says, the way is narrow, the doors are hard to force. The analogy here, the symbolism here is perfect and complete. And it's worth dwelling upon each of these and sometimes reviewing them over a few days or weeks to really understand fully the sense of this. But when he says, for example, the way is narrow, what is the sense of this narrowness? When you study Sri Aurobindo's yoga and the practice of the integral yoga, you will find Sri Aurobindo does not follow the conventional methods. He does not follow the normal processes that you will find in any tradition, religion, yogic school, or lineage. Any of those that you join, the first thing they will say, start with this practice, do this for so many years, then we will give you the next practice and the next and the next. You come to Sri Aurobindo, he does not give you any of that. You read his books, you do not find any of that. To the extent that there have been people, this is no more the case, but my teacher N.P. Pandit records this, how somebody came to his office, picked up a book which was titled Kundalini Yoga. Having gone through it, she said, "Have you written this book?" He says, "Yes." He says, "You've written it here?" He says, "Yes." And then she asks, "That means people here practice yoga?" He says, "Yes." And she says, "But I don't see anyone practicing yoga." Why? Because there was no obvious procedure given, technique given for practice. Of course, there are techniques and procedures and processes, etc., all described, but it is not sequential. It is simultaneous, multidimensional, multifaceted, and most of them are even psychological, not material, so not obviously visible, and so on. But if you choose to do them, if you don't, you would not distinguish the difference between someone who practices and someone who does not. Nevertheless, if you make the basic effort of opening, whether you practice or not, to the mother's force, the action of her force can begin the process irrespective. It takes longer because now she has to build in you the awakening that you will begin to participate. It takes a little longer, but nevertheless, something still happens. The point though is, there is a specific method Sri Aurobindo describes, which is at the heart of all the efforts of all the processes of the integral yoga, which I have, for various reasons, referred to as the direct method. And Sri Aurobindo himself elaborates upon this substantially in the Synthesis of Yoga, in his letters, where by a process of direct concentration, by a focus of concentration and a dwelling upon that which you seek to realize, you attain to the experience. And he describes 3 stages of that deepening of the experience and so on. But the method is essentially to begin with the tapas, the gathered concentration of all your awareness one-pointedly on that which you seek to realize. Now, in the context of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo, it means putting the whole of you directly, as entirely as possible, directly in relation with the divine. Now, that's still a state of concentration. It's a one-pointed concentration. To the extent that in everything you do, at all times you dwell on the perception of the divine and you're turning and opening and self-giving to the divine in everything, at all times, in every moment. Now, we may not begin with that. We may begin with the part that's available. Nevertheless, you see, the nature of this is a concentrated, one-pointed focus. And this is the sense of what he describes as the way is narrow. Because at that moment, it's as if you have to set aside all the secondary and tertiary truths, which is that, oh, this is a wall, this is a flower, this is a person that I don't like. Those are the secondary truths. The underlying deeper truth is all this is the divine presence, appearing, expressing itself, organizing itself through so many forms. And when you dwell upon that, for example, just the dwelling upon it, in a few days, it begins to dawn upon you. The process could be as simple as that to begin with. But it requires this one-pointed narrowness of focus, so therefore the way is narrow. Because to break out, you cannot break out like sheep wandering here and there. You have to take a one-pointed focus to cut through like a laser. The second, the doors are hard to force. In a sense, you're forcing your way by the concentration, by the will, by the movement of the self-giving, and so on. But they're harder to force because they have been so neglected for so long. They belong to layers of our consciousness in which we are not fully awake. And therefore our access to the door handle is not so obvious. Where is this? I can't feel it. But when you hold that focus, gradually it begins to become accessible. There's a point where you become able to feel it, and then you're able to consciously open it. And still there is a resistance because there's a lack of familiarity. But once the door is forced open even a little bit, if I could recall the exact words from Savitri, when Sri Aurobindo says how God steals in like a thief, even if the door is a little bit ajar. If you make just that one little movement of a partial opening, immediately the working of the force begins to become direct, where earlier it was indirect. And with that, all the rest begins to happen. Even the forcing of the door open is now taken up by the force working in you, not relying on your strength anymore. And this is the nature of the integral yoga, where at first there is a very small effort required on your part. Very quickly, with that little effort, the action of the mother's force working in you directly begins to amplify your effort. And so the growth is what you would call an exponential curve. It's not a linear curve as in other paths, which are entirely dependent on your effort. There is an exponential curve where even a little effort, I'm quoting from Sri Aurobindo, where even a little effort produces great results and changes destiny. This is the hour of God. And then he contrasts this with the other extreme, when spaces of time when much labor goes to the making of a little result. And I would literally put these two as the differences of approach in the yoga itself. But that initial effort is absolutely required, and it's very small, and it's very easy, it's very accessible. The consequence of that, though, is the opening to and of these experiences beginning rapidly. I could draw upon one example Sri Aurobindo himself narrates. This is before he even enters formally into the intensity of his sadhana. He has just been put into jail and in solitary confinement, and he is, in the first few days, it is maddening, and he feels as if he is unable to even contain his thoughts, and there is the help given at that point. But then he is given the chance to step out and walk in the courtyard for a few hours every day. And he describes how, as he walks from one end to the other, he dwells upon the perception of the divine presence everywhere. Sometimes repeating the mantra, the ageless mantra, he says, of Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma, all this is the Brahman. Sometimes simply in the dwelling on the idea, on the perception, and imprinting consciously this perception that within everything is the divine presence. And he describes how within a few days, and remember that's 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day at most, within a few days he begins to perceive this presence growing more vivid, more intense, more profound, until literally it feels as if the Lord himself is playing at his flute under the tree and drawing out his very soul, quoting fragments from his. And with that begins an enormous change in his consciousness, where he says his nature, which was largely rajasic, now begins to acquire strong sattvic character, gushes of love flowing from his heart, and so on. Deep sense of peace and ahimsa, and so on, which are very contrary to his rajasic nature. His nature is beginning to change. And all this is happening within the few weeks. Later, in one of those descriptions, he narrates how his hair was shiny. And the other prisoners with him were surprised. They said, are the guards giving you oil secretly to apply on your hair? And Sri Aurobindo's reply is no. He says there is, because of the action of the yoga force, there is a process of change in the cellular working, and the body is producing the necessary required oil, which keeps the hair shiny. Now, if you consider what he is doing at that time in terms of sadhana, in the most extreme condition of fear and threat, where his life is on the line, he might just be sent to the gallows within a few weeks or months. He's just been taken out, snatched out at great personal pain from the struggle for India's freedom to which he has dedicated his life, and he might just be killed within a few weeks or months. That's the kind of tension one would have in such a state. And he's doing his sadhana, and the rapidity of the growth of the sadhana. And I'm giving this as an example to show you simply how easily accessible the whole working of this yoga can be, if one chooses to give it the necessary time and effort. And that's why the whole point of this discussion is for me precisely to highlight this. Do not think in terms of postponing for another life. Do not think in terms of waiting. Do not think in terms of difficulty. Set aside your skepticism. Because what is at work here is a power far greater than ours in the very nature of this sadhana. And start now, do not wait. Because you have taken birth for this. It's not by chance that we are here. Recall, recover, remember, and start now. Do not wait. There are, in the further development of the integral yoga, broadly, as already familiar in the theme of this conference, the three directions. There is an upward ascent of consciousness, there is a widening into a cosmic dimension of consciousness, and there is a deepening inward into the psychic being, the soul, and the self. These three being broadly three directions, we have still to make a very important distinction. And because all of us, without exception, come with the baggage of the past teachings, especially from the ascetic traditions. And the ascetic traditions have created a false division of life and of spirituality. Spiritual life is separated from material life. And so necessarily, as a consequence, you either follow material life or spiritual life, which means as a consequence, you will postpone spiritual life for later when you retire or when you cannot live your material life anymore or whatever. But Sri Aurobindo, first of all, heals this division. All life is yoga. And everywhere, at all times, in all activities, one should be able to put into practice the yoga itself. And that's the nature. One of the three, he uses this phrase, outstanding features of the integral yoga. Outstanding means no other yoga has this. And of these three outstanding features, one of them is that you can actually use every circumstance of life as a means for the sadhana. The other outstanding features are, it does not require it doesn't have a prior requirement or preparation. You can begin wherever you are because it takes up all the parts of your nature. So it doesn't matter where you are, which part is less developed or more developed, you begin from there. And then the third outstanding feature is that the whole of your nature is taken up. Now, you can dwell upon each of these, and I won't go too much into detail, and contrast this with the existing traditions and all existing paths and teachings and religions, all of them without exception. That being the case, you have to appreciate that the integral yoga has many other fundamental distinctions also, for which, if we come with this prior mindset of the ascetic or other paths, we often misread Sri Aurobindo and misunderstand him. So it is important for us to disabuse ourselves of the distortions introduced by those traditions, the primary one being the separation of spiritual life from the material life. But the second one, which is very important for us also, maybe there are a few more, is the recognition that the realization of the divine or of the self is not a one-off thing. Disconnected from this, there is a continuum bridging the two. In the traditional Vedantic teachings as it is today, from mind you leap to self. In between is a gap. And the gap is such, they will even in the tradition describe the mind as the peak of the mountain, which is our adhara, our being. And the top part is kind of lit up because the mind is semi-conscious or somewhat conscious. The rest is less conscious or unconscious. And then from this peak, up there is the self and there's nothing in between. Obviously, then you leap into self or you fall back. And it's a huge effort. The leap itself requires a massive preparation. It might happen, it might not. When you actually look at those traditions, you will find the nature of the practice as being, keep doing this until one day something happens. And if it doesn't happen, well, keep doing it. And certainly that's not a very happy, easy or accessible form of practice. In the integral yoga, on the contrary, there is a continuum that bridges the divine consciousness with wherever we are in all the parts of our being, in all the parts of our consciousness, in all the parts of our nature. And this distinction between consciousness and nature again becomes critical for the integral yoga, because the goal here is not only awakening of consciousness, but awakening of nature and transformation of consciousness and transformation of nature. So both have to be, and there has to be a parallel movement of this divinization. But that being one of the important distinctions, remember there's a continuum. That means from wherever we are, instead of leaping into something beyond with some Herculean effort, we make one small step and another small step every day. And every step also involves a descending movement of an integration from the higher to the lower. As a result, each time that you've had one little experience, let us say, and then you take the trouble to integrate it with the rest of you, the next effort becomes that much easier. Because now that experience infusing in the rest of you makes all the rest much more open and accessible to that very same experience, and then perhaps even more easily to the next. And so again we see here the same process of an acceleration in the very consequence of the same effort you might make, and its exponential curve, because every time you have touched something higher, it helps you for gaining itself as well as the next. But this is true in all the parts of our nature, because everything is being turned. So as a result, again a greater distinction from the other systems, as a result, since all of you now opens and begins to make the upward movement, the gap between your higher and your lower parts is made narrow. Where in the traditional paths, you have the peak of the mountain which is going to make the leap, and the rest of the mountain is going to stay exactly where it is. Your body effectively, for example, and the body consciousness is left behind and abandoned in its inertia. Here, everything is taken up. The practical difference is this. In the traditional paths, when your higher rises, your lower remains behind. The gap between the higher and the lower growing, the pull of the lower upon the higher is also more powerful. And as a result, a violent oscillation of states of consciousness. I had a beautiful experience of some kind of delight. I come back and I fall into the darkness of my surface body or otherwise. And then I struggle, and more there is a need to create a further schism and cut off the two and separate them, which is a very painful and difficult and nearly impossible process, because everything in nature is designed to prevent you from precisely cutting off. Because the goal of nature was perfection and realization and transformation, not cutting off and abandonment. Whereas in the integral yoga, because all of you is taken up, the gap between your higher peaks and the lower ranges actually narrows. The result is a greater ease in the journey itself. And all in you, all of your nature actually is made a part of the journey. No more this oscillation. The more you grow, the less the oscillation, the more stable and complete and perfect, integral is the result of the sadhana. And as a result, as a consequence, even the capacity then to express, to manifest all that is received. Now, all of this is to highlight the necessity of abandoning our prior conceptions of the nature of yoga, of the spiritual life, and specifically in the context of the integral yoga. Because otherwise, all of us come with that baggage, and we tend to replace our prior practices and forms with this something from here taken from Sri Aurobindo, but within the context and framework of that prior practice, which leads to the failure. Because here it is a fundamentally different form of practice, and we have to be conscious of these differences. And unfortunately, even among those who have grown up in the ashram, that difference has not been made, and you hear all kinds of erroneous formulations of Sri Aurobindo's teaching in superficial and what we would call pop psychology kind of wrong statements. So this is very important for us to recognize that as a consequence, naturally, everything also is that much more accessible, that much more easy once we begin the sadhana. And so we come back to the description of these three: movement upward in the heightening of consciousness. Because there is a continuum from the highest to where we are, there is never a leap. There is only a progression of steps and gradations, and as a consequence, a descent, which completes this cycle of ascent and a descent. This rapidly grows because the higher descending assists the next ascent of the height. So there are many important distinctions in the way the operation affects the chakras and the kundalini, which makes for the fact that Sri Aurobindo hardly speaks of chakras and kundalini, barely in passing. It's not significant. We attain to the same results by means which are far more rapid, far more reliable, far more safe and effective. So I won't go into those details. The point is there is this upward movement and consequent descent. The second dimension of this growth of consciousness is the widening. And we understand that initially from within our human experience as feeling ourselves as if connected with everything, feeling everything more and more as if our own family, as a part of us, and as if ourselves more and more in others. And all this is very good, except that you will discover there are people who take ayahuasca or MDM or other drugs, or it's more fashionable to say plants, who describe exactly the same thing. So I recall in the United States at some university which was dedicated to spirituality, there was this question one of the students raised, is there a difference? And sadly, there were many practitioners of various religions who actually said, one of them said, that's cheating, that's taking a shortcut. Another said, our tradition does not accept that, we should not do it. Why? There was no reason given. And for those young people, if there's a shortcut, why not? Do the shortcut. Why would you want to take the long way? Right? Nobody had the clarity of understanding that they are not the same thing. And this is sadly the condition of spiritual teachings today in traditions across the world. It's not fair to say these things blatantly in those spaces, but certainly in our space we can speak about it. The reality is that out there in the mass of humanity, the true understanding of what spiritual growth means is so shallow, is so limited as to be almost confusing. And therefore, all these new age systems and practices which make a mix of everything and a hodgepodge, and people find that it makes sense to them because there is no understanding of what that actually is. And so to this, the response we would give from the context of Sri Aurobindo's formulation of the nature of reality is that very simply, at every level of consciousness, there is an opening to universality. In the physical consciousness, in the lower vital consciousness, in the nervous consciousness, in the plant consciousness, in the animal consciousness, in the emotional consciousness, in the intellectual consciousness, in all gradations where there's a continuum, remember, there's an opening to universality. So when you take those plant substances, which is the way to say it politely, instead of saying drugs, or hallucinogenic drugs, which is not considered to be polite to those who take them, then you're opening to the grade of consciousness of that plant lower vital. And in that grade, experiencing some kind of universality. And you will have experiences which will match very carefully the same description. Oh, I felt like I was one with the universe. Everything was inside me. I was in everything, but I was overwhelmed. It was too much, etc. And after that, when you come back, you are totally disoriented. And as a consequence also, you end up with some damage to your powers of intelligence and so on. Now, to understand in the context of Sri Aurobindo's explanation, this is simply you've opened to a very low grade of the vital consciousness in its grade of universality. And as a result, you did not fundamentally change in consciousness. I'm using the word carefully, fundamentally. You did open to some universality, so something did change. But fundamentally, you were of the same grade. And as a consequence, you felt it overwhelming. Because you were still the small person who were experiencing a large universality of opening, which overwhelms you. Even it invades you in a way as to destabilize you. And some people, having had that destabilization, struggle then to find stability for the rest of their life. And their spiritual potential is damaged because of loss of stability on a lower level, which leaves them open to intrusions on those levels and attacks on those levels. They don't know how to close the gates once opened. So these things are extremely dangerous, but we have to distinguish this has nothing to do with the spiritual experience, even if in the human vocabulary there are similarities. So once you understand this, you shun those methods. And you distinguish between an experience that describes something similar, you distinguish from saying, but it's not the same thing. And this again is a problem you will find when you look across various mystical traditions, even within Christianity or in Sufism, you have mystical groups and you'll have experiences described by them and you'll say, yes, it's the same thing. That's what Sri Aurobindo said. No, it's not. There is a difference, and this is the difference. And you should be able to make that distinction. Otherwise, we fall into the same old trap and we make the same mistakes. So, as we have gradations vertically, on each of those gradations, there is an opening to the wideness and the infinity. And any opening that you may have, whatever that may be as an experience, and it's not difficult to have these, you must know it is the beginning of something much more. That it is an opening only on one grade. And that you have to eventually experience, and this would be the goal in the integral yoga, to experience universality on all planes equally. Let us say for the moment that you have an experience of an opening into universality in the mind consciousness, and perhaps something in the higher part of the vital, and perhaps for some it might even happen in some higher part of the physical consciousness. The mentalized physical can have a similar experience, not with too much difficulty. Then you will discover that these experiences, each of the three, are completely different, and you have no way to integrate them. Because the universality experienced in the mind is fundamentally different from universality in the vital. And it feels so different. I can shift into this, I can shift into that. But how do I stay in both? I'm as if split into two universalities, or three in that case. How do I integrate? And you cannot. And here again, Sri Aurobindo gives you the clarity which you do not find in any other tradition. I'm sorry I'm repeating this. It's not to highlight an exclusivism, but is to highlight the fact that because of the richness of Sri Aurobindo's own experience and the richness of the nature of the integral yoga, all this needed to be mapped out. That's why Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga is such a fat book. There are people who will tell you, you surrender yourself to the mother and she will do all the sadhana and that's all, there's nothing else to be done. And the simple question you would ask is, why did Sri Aurobindo write such a big fat book? It's called the Synthesis of Yoga. He could have said, well, just do this, it's so simple. And it's disgusting sometimes to hear these things. Somebody in Auroville even went to the extent of saying, quoting from Sri Aurobindo's letter, saying, see, Sri Aurobindo, quoting from the mother, from the agenda, saying, mother said, if Sri Aurobindo had been in the body, he would have surely reviewed his position, and here I found that the mantra is giving everything necessary, and without the mantra it would not be possible. This is 1959, the mother says this. And and this person said, so see what is easy thing in the integral yoga, just repeat the mother's name and everything is done for you. So if that was so simple, then he would not have written the Life Divine or the Synthesis of Yoga. He would have said, well, just follow all the existing knowledge in your tradition. What's the big deal? Because this is already available knowledge. Repeat the mother's name. And it's so disgusting to see this because it creates such a huge confusion. When in fact you read the full text of the mother, the picture is completely different. And these are selective quotations which are done very harmful, and that's why compilations the mother had warned against do not lose the context. And this is actually propagated in the ashram and in various centers related to the ashram. So do not make those mistakes. Just to make the point as regards this text, the mother describes there how she had already attained to the realization of the self and then attained the realization of the divine for her body consciousness. She was at that point working in the transformation of the cellular consciousness, which already means she is conscious of each cell and the consciousness in each cell in her body. Now that's way beyond anything we have access to currently. And then she says, in order to assist the cells to awaken, the rhythmic repetition of the mantra was helpful, because the body consciousness is a consciousness of repetition, of mechanical repetition, and so a mechanical process was helpful there. And she mentions Although Sri Aurobindo had always wanted the process to be done by purely psychological means, perhaps had he been in the body, he would have accepted that this was helpful. That's the context of that comment. You see, it's not that you do japa and the sadhana is done by your japa. And in fact, 3 or 4 years later, in the playground during one of the talks, she is asked, what is the benefit of japa? And she says simply, it makes your mind dull and fills it with inertia. No spiritual value. So you see, the context has to be clearly understood. Now, why am I going into all this detail? Because I want to, well, since we are already mapping out the nature of these experiences imminent, it's important to make these distinctions. So on each level, there is this opening to universality, and 2 of these universalities may not harmonize. And Sri Aurobindo alone gives you the knowledge of how to harmonize them, because there is a consciousness above, of which all of these are special gradations. And it is in that consciousness that the harmonization takes place. And the integral yoga aims towards that. Now, if this be the case, one of the features, one of the characteristics of the approach of the integral yoga, which again distinguishes it from other systems, including even the Vedic system, and that's something quite extraordinary in itself. Sri Aurobindo says that while in the Vedic system the effort was to go step by step and from each step reintegrate, now this would be the logical thing even in the integral yoga, he says our effort is to go as rapidly as we can to the highest and then from there do the integration. It's a strategic shift. But the consequence of that is again an enormous acceleration in the result of the integral yoga. The process being still essentially same, by this shift in strategy, the result is enormously accelerated, and this opening to universality on every level, instead of being done one step after another, which is the slow process of the Vedic yoga, we go as far as we can, as high as we can to a highest and opening to the highest universality, and from there integrating downward. The result is there is an integration, but also an opening to universality on all these other levels by an ease, by a means of the higher opening, which already has access to this. So the nature of our personal effort is so much shortened, so much simplified, so much made accessible again. So this distinction again I'm highlighting so that we understand the nature of the approach, but also that all of these now become accessible by the simple fact of having reached and touched some higher grade. And it may not be the highest. Of course, the goal is to get to the highest, but the moment you reach to whatever highest you can, for the moment, you integrate top down. Comes now the third dimension of an inward opening to the inner gradations of consciousness. Sri Aurobindo takes again great pains to describe these gradations, name them in various ways, which you will not find in other traditions, for the simple reason that they don't need it. Their goal being very simplistic: from here you leap into the self, merge into God, get into some heavenly realm, abandoning the world, and there's no in-between link, it doesn't matter. But since here the goal is a transformation and the building of the continuity in the transformation, all these have to be mapped out, and therefore again the thickness and the processes which Sri Aurobindo describes, the difficulties of each of these stages and so on. It doesn't mean we will face all of them, but by mapping them out, he gives you a rationale to the framework of the practice. But also when you do face them, you understand their context and you know the means to rapidly overcome them. So in this inward movement, we discover there is an inner mind, an inner vital, an inner physical, which again deepens and opens out again into infinity, to the whole universe, even joining with the universe, the whole inner realm. And this is fascinating because now it changes our perspective of the nature of consciousness. Where in the textbook, you will be shown these 3 dimensions. Yes, there's an upward, there's a horizontal, and then maybe there's an inner. The reality is not so simple. The reality is that for every inward shift, there is also an universality. For every upward shift, there are gradations of inward shift. And for each one of those gradations of inward shift, there is a universality of its grade. Now you understand the complexity. Take any level, shift in, let's say, an infinity of gradations, and each of those has its grade of universality and its worlds. Then go one fine step above, and again you have an infinity inward and an infinity outward, and a fine step above, infinity inward, infinity outward. You can't draw this on a picture, isn't it? And therefore, the simplification, and obviously many who just simply repeat what they've read and not. So, all of these have to be mastered. In all, you have to become conscious. In all, you have to become effective as a participant in the divine consciousness, because the divine is there and there are gradations of divine consciousness. You want to know the divine the way the divine knows itself entirely. So, all these need to be known, isn't it? How would you do that? Obviously, it might take centuries if you follow the slow way. Again, there, the same method. You go directly to the center, as deep as you can to begin with, but eventually all the way to the center in the psychic being, the soul that chose to incarnate, which supports the mind, the vital, and the physical, and finer gradations of higher levels developed, if they are developed. And that is the spontaneous, natural master of this whole inner domain. Reaching to that first, the opening of the inner domains becomes easily accessible, spontaneously available, by its action emergent, by its influence growing within you. And so again we find, while the goal is set to be so vast, so large, so demanding, so complete, so integral, the means used actually makes it easily accessible. And again, I've used this word imminent because simply, if your soul was conscious of the reason why it took birth, and the fact that you recognized Sri Aurobindo's teaching as what you want is evidence that the soul was conscious of why it has taken birth. That means for you to become conscious of the soul's consciousness should also be easy, isn't it? If only you make that little effort. And again, the nature of the effort is similar to what we described before. The way is narrow, a concentration on that, dwelling upon the aspiration and the love that grows out from within you, that turns to the Divine Mother, and then going back to its source. Literally, and you may draw upon this in the Vedic vocabulary, in the Vedic symbolism, a flow of water from within the cave that comes out through the mouth of the cave. You can drink the water at the mouth of the cave. Yes, it is sweet, but you can also follow it to its source. And then it's a passage inward into the cave until you reach the source within you. This is the great symbolism which is externalized in the traditional pilgrimage that you make to the source of the Ganga. Why do you want to go to the Gangotri? What is special? Well, it's just a chunk of ice which is melting. What's the big deal? It's the symbolism of this. You go back to the true Gangotri, the purity of the Ganga that flows from within you, from its source, which is the divine presence within you. And if its influence reaches to the surface, and we all feel it, none of us can say we have not felt it, then you should be able to trace it back to its source, because that's the link, the thread that takes you back. It is the same, I don't remember, in the Greek tradition, the idea of the thread through which you come out of the maze and come back to your source, to the freedom, and so on. But this being the case, having come to the center of the psychic influence and the presence, from then on to integrate this into all the levels of consciousness and to activate this influence in your life, make it the leader, the center of your being, that's the process to be done. But the reaching of the presence is within your reach. The integration now then is a process of joy to greater joy. Having touched the source of nectar, all further steps, however long they may take, however difficult they may be, will be steps of joy, because the nectar is always present. And it is the same in the upward movement, it is the same in the outward movement. The principal method being given, the basic approach being accessible, what remains for us is this concentrated effort that we need to make in our lives, and that is the tapas, with which accompanying it is the Shraddha, the faith, the innate knowledge of the thing which we seek to realize. So, my objective in all this was to bring us to some recognition of the importance of the opportunity given to us in this lifetime. Remember, we are not here by chance. We chose this birth. We were given a chance by the Mother and Sri Aurobindo because they promised. And if we have come here not by chance for this mission, then for us to wake up to it and begin to practice is absolutely essential. Otherwise, at the end of the life, when we are ready to discard our body, when the soul emerges from the body consciousness and frees itself from this dulling forgetfulness, it will look back and say, oh, I missed the greatest opportunity of my life. Let that not be our case, because this opportunity will not come again. We are so close to the event of the avatar. The presence is still powerful. Those of you who have been in the ashram long enough or have been visiting long enough, you've seen how much of a dilution has taken place just in the last 10 years or 20 years with all the visitors and the load of tourists that come. And this will grow worse. It's not to make you feel bad about it. This is a reality and we have to face it. If you wait for your next incarnation, it will not be the same. Circumstances will be different. Perhaps in other ways they may be far worse or they might be better, irrelevant. The presence given to you, the opportunity given to you in this lifetime, look at the time it took you to come to the point where you are. To wake up to this, to actually be interested, to want to commit yourself to deepen into an experience. Look at how much you have to go through. At least the first 20 years of your life you just spent to grow into a conscious individual. And even then that's not complete. So look at the time it took. We should not have to repeat all that. Let's catch this moment and make the most of it. And for this, Sri Aurobindo and the Mother are present with the promise that they have given to us and with the help that they are actively giving to us even now to start this. I come back to this text and the portion. If mankind could but see, though in a glimpse of fleeting experience, what infinite enjoyments, what perfect forces, what luminous reaches of spontaneous knowledge, what wide calms of our being lie waiting for us in the tracts which our animal evolution has not yet conquered, they would leave all and never rest till they had gained these treasures. But the way is narrow, the doors are hard to force, and fear, distrust and skepticism are there, sentinels of nature, to forbid the turning away of our feet from her ordinary pastures. And I want to conclude with one text of Sri Aurobindo from one of his sonnets, where he describes the condition of what happens when we actually take a few steps in this direction. The state of consciousness in which we live and accessible, reachable for us as we are today. It's a sonnet titled Bliss of Identity. All nature is taught in radiant ways to move. All beings are in myself embraced. O fiery, boundless heart of joy and love, how art thou beating in a mortal's breast? It is thy rapture flaming through my nerves, and all my cells and atoms thrill with thee. My body thy vessel is, and only serves as a living wine cup of thy ecstasy. I am a center of thy golden light, and I its vast and vague circumference. Thou art my soul, great, luminous, and white, and thine my mind and will and glowing sense. Thy Spirit's infinite breath I feel in me. My life is a throb of thy eternity. So, simple question I would ask, would you like to experience this? Thy rapture flaming through my nerves and all my cells and atoms thrilling with thee, my body thy vessel, serving as a living wine cup of thy ecstasy. This is imminent, within reach, and all the past efforts of humanity and our own journey across lives have brought us to this threshold where we can realize all that Sri Aurobindo has given to us. Let's make the first step now and every day. I don't think we have time for questions, so we'll just use this. Yes. We have? Okay. Or we can just close with a short concentration on this. Okay, fine.
Yes.
Thank you to that. So I have a question about the inward opening. How we can open to the psychic being, and what is the difference between self and psychic being?
The self, by definition, is beyond space time and therefore complete and unchanging. It always is everything, all its potential is included. It cannot experience evolution. This is the commonest criticism you will have from the traditionalists against Sri Aurobindo. What is this evolution you're talking about? And as some of the big ones, big names, it won't be nice to name them, head of entire lineages of traditions, highly respected, have criticized Sri Aurobindo on this. The distinction, though, which they ignore is that in the manifestation, the self unfolds infinitely, never repeating itself. And if nothing is ever repeated, then every new movement that comes is as if building on something which was impossible before, and that's the sense of evolution. If evolution is inherent to the self deploying itself and manifesting itself, and therefore it's not a contradiction, although the self contains everything as potential. So a part of the self now entering space and time, taking incarnation as a focal point, that's your psychic being. Which, although in quality essentially the self, in potential can now unfold and grow and evolve. So the self is the part in you that supports the whole evolution, already contains all that the evolution will realize. The psychic being is the part of the self that enters space and time with limitation and incapacity and grows to its full potential of capacity, manifesting what the self holds in its infinite potential. Does that make sense? So the two are linked. They are at their essence the same, but in their form different. And the psychic being is your self entering, embodying itself, incarnating and growing through lives. And it builds, it's not just the being, it grows and it builds a personality, builds capacities across these lives. Every experience it takes as a nourishment to grow. And it is this, when you take births, which infuses into the new fetus, the new body, the characteristics of the personality it has built up into the next, with the content of the experiences of its maturing and growth into the next, sometimes selectively for the work to be done. And therefore the realization of the psychic being is a necessary first step if we are to know the self truly. Otherwise, an experience of the self without the consciousness of the psychic being would simply create this gap between the world and forms and the self, which is beyond in space and time. The psychic being the link, then allows you to recognize the world as real and as divine. And therefore, it is a capital correction in the integral yoga.
How do you live in that?
How do you reach that consciousness and live in it? By recognizing first that it is conscious. You may not be conscious of it, it is conscious of you. And therefore, the fact that you turn in aspiration means its response also is towards you. See, in the bhakti tradition, they will say, you remember God because God remembered you first. To which my criticism would be, that means God forgot me all this while, that I remembered Him only now. You see the point? Logically, it does not stand, though there's a truth to it. The truth is that when the divine pulls, nudges, you wake up, oh, there's something I'd forgotten, right? So your psychic presence within you has always been putting a steady pressure, but occasionally it can put a large nudge, and suddenly you wake up and say, what am I doing? Where's my life going? I feel like I've wasted my time. Fine. Who woke you up? Become conscious. But then observe that somewhere from deep within you is this influence that comes, and it comes from the psychic being, which turns in an aspiration to the divine. Why do you seek the divine? Why do you feel this familiarity with the Mother, with Sri Aurobindo, with the divine presence in whatever form it may be? What is the meaning or sense, the quality of this familiarity? From where does this love and devotion and the sense of feeling of sacred come for the presence which I feel of the Mother? Observe. That's your link. Become conscious of that. And then live in that first. Live in that which you feel in the form of a bhakti, in the form of a sense of sacred, in the form of the love and self-giving and aspiration to the divine. Do not make the mistake of allowing it to become emotional and devotional bhakti. That's a digression, that's a loss. You will lose the psychic link with that. Make it very pure and quiet. Hold that. Stay. Maybe spend a few minutes every day dwelling in that. Once you have this familiarity, feel its source more deeply. Go slightly deeper. Every day, a little more deep, a little more deep, a little more deep. And there comes a point where you'll feel you can't go deeper. That's where you have to say, well, there is something more. Wait. Allow yourself to be carried. Allow the presence, the psychic being within you is helping you. Trust that. The mother is helping you, pulling you within. Allow yourself to be carried. And then you will find sometimes spontaneously you will go into a depth which you never thought possible. And you'll come back from that with a full, deep, intense sense of the influence and presence. And with that, the breakthrough will begin where you will be able to consciously enter and remain in its influence. So two things happen. You are making an outside-in effort, and at the same time, from within, there is an inside-out push. The two will meet. Both are necessary. But you don't stop with that. You let yourself go all the way until one day you will have a direct experience of the psychic being within you. You will know yourself truly as the one who took birth. And you will feel with that your immortality. And you will feel yourself a child of the Divine Mother. And this will be a real experience. But before that, already the strong influence will fill your life, more and more shape it. And spontaneously, effortlessly, your thoughts will change, your priorities will change, your friends will change, your interests will change. Because that influence filling you, suddenly many things which were interesting before become meaningless, other things become really important to you. And all that will happen by its influence, not with your effort. Your effort is limited to dwelling on in its influence and allowing it to deepen. The rest will be led by the help from within and from the mother. Trust that and just begin with this. You can feel it's accessible, right? This is very much close to you. Take those small steps.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You'll have to tell me when we stop. Is that okay? Then we'll just close with a short concentration, recalling this. Again, I remind you, the reason why we took birth, the promise given to us by the mother, and the opportunity that we have, which will not come again, which has not been in the past, it will not be in the future. Make the most of this and let this be our aspiration. From now, every day, one small step in the sadhana of the integral yoga, with the constant help and guidance of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo. Namaste.